The simulation hypothesis is a thing which Elon likes to talk about. In fact, this idea has really taken off recently. Like, everyone seems to be discussing the possibility that we may be inside a simulation. But what isn't discussed as much, even though it needs to be taken into consideration, is the fact that this hypothesis seems fundamentally unprovable. Like, if we're inside a simulation, how would you prove that there's something outside of the simulation, since you're a simulated being within the simulation? So I mean, even if you could speculate that there is something outside of the simulation, you would never be able to observe that. So logically speaking, this is an unprovable hypothesis. Except there might be a way to exit the simulation, or at least that is what could be implied by the breakthrough experience. So before we begin the discussion of things which are completely speculation and not yet established fact, I want to let you all know about my new coaching service, and you can sign up for a free consultation for that. I'll have a video coming up soon which actually covers what the coaching service entails. But if you're at all interested in that, I encourage you to check out my website. Link probably in the description, unless I'm too stupid to remember to put it there. But yeah, if you want to sign up and have a conversation with me, we could definitely set that up. So to recap what the series has been about thus far. First, we started by discussing psychedelics and how psychedelics can influence the mind. And then we began discussing a very particular psychedelic known as DMT, which, when taken as a vapor or even injected intravenously, produces an experience, assuming you take enough, which is best described as the most intense experience which a human being can possibly undergo. They are thrust into another world, and from their perspective, this world is as real, if not more real, than the physical world. And this world is inhabited by entities who tell you all these profound things. Now, this could be just a massive hallucination that's happening inside your head, and it could be nothing more than that. But nearly everyone who has this experience genuinely believes that it happened. They don't come back thinking, oh, it was just like a dream. They genuinely feel like they went to another place. So imagine what kind of an experience would cause a person to think like that. Of course, we don't really know exactly what's going on, but I did put forth fairly good reasons, here you go, Teddy, that this DMT dimension, as I've been calling it, may actually be a genuinely real place. It may actually somehow exist. And there is even a way to prove this hypothesis. So if we can prove it, it would be the most incredible discovery, I think, ever, actually, because there's nothing that we've discovered so far in science even compares to something like that. The possibility of this other dimension existing side by side with ours that somehow we can access. But before we can actually do the experiment and prove it, all we can really do is theorize. And, no theory is better than any alternative theory. I do try to confine my theorizing to what I think is the most logical, explanation. But of course, I could be completely wrong. I could be, missing the mark completely. So there are other possibilities, and this doesn't exhaust what could be happening. But one very real possibility is that the DMT breakthrough experience is actual proof of the simulation hypothesis, something which a lot of people have considered completely unprovable. We may actually have genuine proof of it, which is crazy. Except when you think about it, this doesn't really make any sense at all. At least with respect to what most people consider when they hear the word simulation. The word simulation itself implies unreality. Like, there is a real world, and then contained within that real world is this simulated world. Our minds, in a sense, are actually kind of like this. We can simulate the world in our minds. Obviously not, a full-scaled version of it, but let's just say you have like an interview coming up and you want to prepare mentally. You can do that. You can kind of simulate what the interview will be like in your head. If you have like a first date coming up, you can do the same thing and like simulate jokes and try to predict which ones will land and which one won't. But I think the most interesting thing we simulate is technology, where we kind of have a mental template of the thing we're going to build, and then of course we eventually put that on paper and then create something out of that. And of course that depends on this simulation device that we have inside our brains. Of course, the main thing that we're interested in are computer simulations. This possibility only became apparent when we first realized the true potential of computing power. If you look at ENIAC, which is the first computer developed by Alan Turing, one of the first ones, the first electronic one, I believe, it's basically just a big calculator. But nobody knew that 70 years later, we would each carry a handheld supercomputer in our pockets. Computers allow us to do crazy things. I can't even begin to explain how essential they are to the modern world, and yet we still haven't fully explored the possibilities of what these devices are capable of. One of the things computers do, and they do really well, is simulate. And they can simulate the stock market, they can simulate the weather, and most of the time these simulations are just numbers on a screen. You don't actually see the actual weather unless it's like there are weather simulations that show you kind of what clouds will look, what the cloud formations will look like and the hurricanes and stuff. But these are far from actually simulating the actual events. There are also these incredible simulations which attempt to simulate the entire formations of galaxies and stars, and of course these are immensely advanced. But the question is, how advanced could simulations become if we devoted a huge amount of resources and energy to it? Of course, this is kind of our limiting factor. The less space we have, the less we can compute. But if you can imagine building a truly massive computer, like something on the scale of a planet, it sounds inconceivable now, but it's perfectly plausible, and given enough time, it's something we could invent. Something like that would be capable of producing even more complicated simulations. We could, for example, try to simulate molecules and down to the individual atom, something which would require an enormous amount of computing power, but again, it's doable in theory. But why stop there? Why not simulate something like the human brain, a very, super complicated system? But if you could simulate everything that's going on inside the human brain, would you be able to simulate consciousness? Maybe, but I'm actually not going to ponder it too much because, I simply don't know. Another question is, could we simulate an entire planet? And can that planet have life? And if we could simulate evolution, evolutionary processes happening on this planet, could we eventually, could this simulated planet eventually evolve intelligent life that becomes self-aware? Again, something like this would seem completely implausible, but again, many philosophers and thinkers have put forth the notion that it's completely possible that given enough computing power, a future civilization, a highly advanced civilization, could produce simulations which more or less replicate this universe. And we could simulate entire galaxies down to the individual atoms. But this, of course, has made us aware of the startling possibility that we ourselves might be simulated. And like I said before, this idea is completely blown up. The philosopher Nick Bostrom has suggested that it seems more likely that we're in a simulation than that we're not in a simulation. The logic goes something like this. If you imagine a universe where intelligent life develops and they produce a simulation, well, it's unlikely that they're just going to produce one simulation because maybe they want to run it multiple times. So they might produce a huge number of simulations. And if inside these simulations intelligent life develops and they produce simulations, the odds of us being in one of the simulated universes is extremely great. So again, this is interesting, and a lot of people have gotten on board with the idea that we're in a simulation, but something like this seems fundamentally unprovable because again, if we're simulated beings, how is it possible to access the kind of world out there? What evidence would we even look for to know that we're in a simulation? And it seems like there's no way around this problem. Now, there's a lot of things I could say about the simulation hypothesis. There are some cool philosophical questions and implications that come with the theory, but I'm sure these have already been discussed to death on other platforms. So what I'm going to do preliminarily is suggest that the DMT breakthrough might actually be genuine proof that we are in a simulation. In fact, there are hints of this throughout various trip reports. Adam himself from Psych Substance, who we discussed in an earlier video, flat out stated that what DMT revealed to him was that the universe was a simulation. And there are also various accounts of people witnessing advanced machines in the DMT world, some even claiming to see devices running like parallel universes, which raises the possibility that there are alternate universes that being simulated that have alternate versions of us inside them. I wouldn't equate that with the many worlds hypothesis in physics. It is technically a different hypothesis, but it's similar to that. And it kind of hurts my head to even think about, so let's just forget about that for now. There are also references to code. I'll quote directly from a trip report found in the book DMT, the Spirit Molecule. It seemed like meaning or symbols were there. Some kind of core of reality where all meaning is stored. I don't know if it is because of my interest in computers or not, but it seems like it's the raw bits of reality. It's a lot more than only ones and zeros. It's higher level, very potent bits. And I find that very interesting that he refers to these very potent bits because, of course, if this is a super advanced simulation, it might be useful to have bits that are more complicated and can store more information than just 0 or 1, which our computers currently use. Something like quantum bits, which can store, I think, 0 and 1 simultaneously. Perhaps he was witnessing that, although I'd imagine it'd be something different. Graham Hancock, whom some of you may know from his books or from his presences on YouTube, had this to say about his experience. The technology of the room seemed to be about displaying some sort of recording that had been set in playback mode by the arrival of my consciousness. It seemed to me to be a very powerful and special kind of recording, one that was interactive beyond the wildest dreams of today's computer programmers. So it's interesting that he uses the word recording here, and I think I might have more to say about that later. Some people have even witnessed entities seemingly working on these simulations, have seen them actually interacting with the simulation. Recall what Philip Markov had to say in his trip report, which we discussed earlier. He said that he had this sense that he was on the Truman Show, that these entities were in some world watching us and that we weren't aware of them. They had cameras watching us and that through DMT, he realized that they were there the whole time. It's almost like we're on some hyperdimensional TV show or something. And of course, the idea of us being in a simulation is consistent with this, because if we're in a simulation, there's a good chance that the entities are looking into our world to see what's going on, which is kind of disturbing, but I mean, it is their simulation. I guess they can do with it whatever they want. Now, again, from the trip reports we get a very clear sense that this world and the technology of this world is far advanced compared to what we have here. And not only that, but this world seems to be composed of like higher dimensions. Like, it isn't like our 3D world. It seems to be composed of more dimensions, 4-dimensional or even higher. And this partially explains why they're capable of making an advanced simulation, along with that, that computer bit thing I said before, because it makes sense to be able to simulate a world which is less complicated than your own world. For example, all of the video games we make and all the simulations we make are inevitably like watered down versions of things in the actual world. The actual world is obviously much more complicated. And in an analogous way, it seems that their world, this DMT world, is much more complicated than our world. That's why it's easier to code a 2-dimensional platformer versus a 3D shooter, because the 2-dimensional platformer is simpler, and so it's easier to develop it. And so it's possible that our world is simpler because it's just easier to code compared to their world. And so even our world, which is the complexity of which is absolutely bonkers, this universe is insane, it's still, nothing compared to what's out there. And this is exactly what we hear in trip reports. When they leave this world and see what's out there, they realize that this world is nothing. It's like a grain of sand compared to what's out there. Now, there's something that I really want to emphasize, and that's the possibility of this being proof of the simulation hypothesis is kind of a result of the fact that we've begun to work with computers and realize their potential. Back when Terence McKenna was doing DMT, he didn't have the idea of the simulation. He probably had it in science fiction, but of course it wasn't a real possibility. And so he never considered the possibility that what he was experiencing was this exit out of a simulation. Instead, he would use words like, that related to spirituality. He believed that the DMT world was the afterlife. And again, I think that part of this is the fact that he didn't have the words to properly express what was actually going on. And now we're in a position where we can make some sort of some coherent notion of it. Although it's very possible that the word simulation doesn't even cover what this really is. It might not be a simulation in the sense that we understand it. It could be something completely different. Although I think it is closer to a simulation than any other possibility. Now, if you think about this deeply, nothing I just said makes any sense whatsoever, logically speaking. Think about it. If we're in a simulation, DMT is also a simulated molecule. Our consciousness is simulated and exists within the simulation. So how is it possible that smoking a simulated molecule can cause us to exit the simulation? It actually makes no sense at all. It would be analogous to like Mario smoking a drug inside the Mario world and then jumping out of the Nintendo. Like it doesn't make sense unless it isn't exactly a simulation. The fact that we can leave the simulation is explained if we posit that this isn't exactly a simulation, but rather something closer to a video game. Now, for some of you, there is no difference between a video game and a simulation. They're basically synonymous. But I'm making a distinction here between them and suggesting that we define simulation as something where the creators don't try to interfere with the process. They just kind of set up the rules and then let the simulation play out and then kind of examine it later. They can make alterations whenever they want, as with any simulation, but when the simulation actually is in progress, they don't interfere because they want to see what the results are. A video game, on the other hand, is a simulation where those on the outside are playing an active role in shaping what's going on. So when you play a video game, you're constantly shaping the outcomes of what's going to happen in that video game because you're the one interacting with it. So whatever would happen in that world automatically no longer happens because you're changing things. Now, these definitions are completely arbitrary. I just made them up for the purpose of discussion. These aren't like hard facts. So we don't need to abide by them completely. But if we posit that this world is more similar to a video game versus a simulation, it explains a lot. For example, it explains why we're seemingly able to exit the video game, because of course we can. We fundamentally belong to that outside world. We are in this world temporarily. The DMT dimension is our actual world. That's where we actually belong. And this is just some temporary thing that we do. So if I'm being honest, this is kind of startling. But I want to make it clear that the word video game is just kind of a placeholder, because we're not sure that the word video game actually describes what this is. Because whatever it is, it clearly isn't just a game. There's something very serious about it, and almost something kind of spiritual and awe-inspiring about this whole thing. Remember, when we're dealing with civilizations that are different from us, we can't just assume that their motivations will be the same as ours. If they've evolved differently, they think differently, and what they're doing can be completely different. So even if we don't necessarily understand the purpose of this video game simulation thing, it's very possible that they do, and that when we exit the simulation via DMT, that we understand it as well. But yeah, there are a lot of implications behind this idea that we are in some kind of a video game, that this whole thing is just some video game we've been playing, that really our actual selves are in the DMT world, and that we're just hooked up into the simulation through which we can, project into this world. And the crazy thing, of course, is that all of this can be proven. You take 3 tokes of DMT and you can see it for yourself. And of course, experiments can subsequently show that these are our actual circumstances. But how mind-blowing is that? There seems to be proof that we're in a video game. We're in a video game. How weird is that? We've been playing a video game where we, role play as humans for 80 years and then die and then supposedly exit the video game. At least that's what it seems like. And, there's so many questions. Are we the players or are we the NPCs? And there's so many things that need to be discussed. So I'll be doing that in the next video, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, thanks for watching. Again, if you're interested at all in having a one-on-one conversation with me, check out my website where you can book a free 15-minute consultation, and we can do that. Anyways, have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.